Next, we're going to move on to something a little bit more strategic and cutting edge. So what I do is speak to Hampshire and hear about Hampshire's work that's been going on in workforce modelling. So we're incredibly lucky today. Harriet's taken time away from drafting the Forces FMS, and she's going to talk to us today about the workforce modelling. So over to Harriet.
Thanks, Ali. Okay, so yeah, my name's Harriet. I'm a lead business analyst within our Corporate Insights Command within Hampshire Constabulary, and I lead a relatively new team within the constabulary made up of 6 data analysts, business analysts and researchers, and we provide a forecasting capability to inform our long-term strategic planning and support the implementation of programmes and projects around our target operating models. So Ali has asked me to provide you with a quick overview of the implementation of the workforce planner model, which we procured from them sort of relatively early last year. So hopefully I'll be able to provide you with some context around kind of why we adopted it, how it fits with our current processes and models, and the inputs and outputs of the model, and then some of the challenges that we faced with implementing it. So as I'm sure you're all aware, and it has been spoken of today a couple of times already, that around kind of 5 years ago, the College of Policing conducted an assessment on all forces, which basically concluded that no force had a comprehensive understanding of what demand it faced in the foreseeable future, and basically determined that approximately 20% of police demand was true crime demand, with the remaining 80% being non-police demand, and that no force was successfully identifying all of its latent and patent demand. It was also becoming increasingly apparent that forces could never meet all of its demand, and that was kind of becoming a growing problem. And obviously, as referenced by Sir Tom Windsor in a recent Home Affairs Committee, this raised questions around all forces' ability to effectively and efficiently deploy its assets and make the best strategic decisions for the future, kind of without that knowledge of demand. Needing kind of more succession planning, HMIC obviously introduced the force management statement, and that basic requirement is that we need a reliable and accessible information on our future demand and the state of our assets over the next 4 years, and for us to be using this information to inform our decision making, particularly in relation to changes to our workforce and our assets to cope with that demand, and to improve the efficiency to reduce the gap between our future demand and capability. So Hampshire was finding kind of the delivery of FMS really challenging at the beginning. Obviously, as you've all mentioned, policing is a complex domain, and the demand is really changeable and dynamic, making it really hard to predict. And we have complex assets which are really difficult to measure. So I think when we last looked, sort of 85% of our costs are people, and obviously it's really hard to assess the competence, skills and kind of health of that asset. And with our kind of annual budget cycles, it makes it really hard to make kind of long-term financial plans. So our business need was really to gain a reliable method for assessing our future demand and capability of our assets, and then look at how the force will meet those future needs. So kind of addressing the skills gap, the shortfalls and the surpluses. So we introduced the workforce planner to address basically 2 key areas. our force management statement, but also to ensure we could take a more proactive rather than reactive approach to our future resourcing. So the process we introduced for achieving this included the use of Tableau, which then informed our RAMP model alongside our other workload profilers tools, process evolution tools, and then that all fed into our workforce planner to provide us with a future workforce plan that was aligned to our demand. So we used historical demand to forecast our crime and incidents, and this year we've understood kind of our COVID suppression and factored that into our recovery. So looking at a slightly different rate of forecasting that demand. We also utilised R to determine the relationship and the impact between external factors on our internal demand. So we looked at things like demographic changes, population growth, changes in kind of points of interest data, and then looking at the correlations with crime demand and incident demand, and then determining whether our current forecasts were an accurate reflection of considering those environmental influences. And then we validated those projections with our subject matter experts across the force, and then fed those demand projections into RAMP to determine the kind of associated resource requirement for our in-scope functions to meet that demand. So our RAMP model includes investigations and local policing at the moment, so our response and patrol and our neighbourhood teams. And then those outputs, just to kind of focus on the workforce planner element, those outputs fed into the workforce planner to determine how we could achieve that resourcing target that had come out of our RAMP modelling. So first we conducted some baseline analysis of our workforce profile, and that kind of informed the structures and rules within the model. So things like the rate of our attrition, looking at when retirements were due, all those things detailed there in the staff flow rules. And then we ran a baseline model based on our current establishment and our current HR policies, so our kind of recruitment and promotion processes. And then we ran a scenario with that future resource numbers that we had calculated in RAMP, and then that went into the workforce planner and generated the results there. And then what we did is we validated the results through workshops at every stage to determine sort of well, not only to get people's views on the outputs, but also to determine some scenarios that we would want to run through the model. So the types of scenarios and the kind of questions and insight that we gained from completing that process was around, so we were able to run or are in the process of kind of running scenarios around the impact of external changes. So we've kept it very strategic. So kind of, you know, does the output allow us to deliver against our PCC priorities, which is currently focused on kind of maximising the visibility of our local policing. So will it allow us to achieve that? Delivering on the beating crime plan. So looking at more focus in offender management and on serious violence and homicide. And then we've also been able to look at the kind of impact of the McLeod pension ruling, particularly on our investigation teams, where those individuals appear to sit. We've been able to kind of predict retirements and therefore sort of how many promotions are likely to happen and what does that mean for training requirements in the future. And it's been fantastic at kind of identifying risks from the workforce data. So identifying departments where we've got limited experience, making us question around, are we concerned that we've got a lot of attrition or retirement in a certain area, and how do we mitigate that risk? As I've said there, diversity and equality reporting and skills reporting. So one really key risk the workforce planner was able to identify for us was that we had a really high proportion of more senior ranks with more than 25 years service. So that presented us with a real challenge within our detective ranks, as we had relatively few DCs, and almost 40% of the existing DCs would be required to replace all those retirements over the next 5 years, if just those with 25 years service were to retire in that period. So that was a massive risk that it was able to identify for us, particularly as kind of the future growth in complex investigations and other attrition that it didn't account for. You know, that was something that we needed to raise and manage quickly. So a couple of challenges that became really evident was the accuracy of our skills data. Our establishment and strength data was acceptable. We had an indication of who worked for the organisation and the departments that they worked in, but our skills data, which we extracted from Mercury, was relatively poor. So according to the records, we had and we explored various skills data sets, and they were all very different. But according to them, we had none of our PIP2 investigators were PIP2 trained. Only 54% of officers were represented in the data, and there was a high proportion of leavers within the data when we cross-referenced it with other inputs. So that was quite a concern. And then yeah, so in terms of how we addressed that at the time, I think we last year we addressed it by just really limiting down the skills that were included in the model, and this year we've taken a more iterative approach. So we've looked at that Mercury data set, and we're just including kind of mandatory skills and those with a financial incentive, so that we know that what we're putting into the model is as accurate as possible. And we're currently embarking on a HR data transformation project to improve our HR data management and maturity, so resolving those data quality issues. So hopefully those two areas will prevent that from happening again. A second challenge, which I'm not sure whether it's detailed on your screens, but it's not on mine, but it was again kind of around stakeholder engagement and management. So getting people to kind of look that far ahead was a real challenge for us. You know, kind of having to explain to people that, you know, I know we can't accurately predict kind of beyond a year, but that certain, you know, and there's so many uncertain events that could occur, but that we needed to kind of model and forecast and provide a kind of resemblance of reality to inform strategic planning and preparedness and improve our resilience and agility, and trying to get people to kind of look up and out and look that far ahead was a key challenge. But I think through kind of good stakeholder analysis through the process, making sure that we had lots of engagement points really helped that relationship, and we were able to kind of guide people through the process, which I think was really helpful. And at a kind of force exec level, identifying some of those key strategic risks, that was when kind of they sat up and kind of listened and kind of really got on board with the model. Oh. And then the final slide, so I've touched on some of the outputs of the model, some of the benefits already, but just to cover a couple more. So it was really good at kind of informing conversations with our PCC around our future budgets. So being able to kind of say, you know, this is the demand that we're expecting, and this is the resource we need, and we can't accommodate that with the current budget. And really being able to have conversations around our risk tolerance, you know, and public tolerance in terms of those risks. So kind of, you know, if this is what we can achieve with our budget, and would the public accept the level of risk that we wouldn't be able to accommodate with our current resource, and we wouldn't be able to service. So that was a really valuable conversation that we could have. It also allowed us to examine some of our priority business processes. So domestic abuse, our conditional caution process was a real key one. Domestic abuse and unemployment had a really strong correlation. And obviously with COVID, we kind of forecast that DA would increase at an accelerated rate to the already upward projection that we had forecast. So that was a key one to determine kind of quantifying the current process and evaluating that process to understand if it would be able to handle that future demand that would flow through it. And informing some of the policies and the financial bids and contracts with external suppliers around that. And also looking at kind of our enabling departments and if they could handle the demand increase. So we specifically looked at criminal justice and our scientific services, but I know we're also looking at the impact across other parts of the organisation due to kind of uplift. The insights also fed some of our key strategic boards. So as I mentioned, the shortfall in detectives, that acted as a catalyst for us to review our rotation policies into investigations. So making sure that we kind of moved people around more to make to build that kind of resilience. And it also informed our kind of uplift and some estates modelling to determine, you know, can we fit people in the right places across our estate, and where do we need to ideally get those uplift officers, where do we need them to be in 4 to 5 years' time. And we were also able to kind of forecast the changes to our workforce demographic. So you can see the little stick men on the right there, and that just kind of shows pre-uplift and post-uplift, kind of the changes in the different generations and therefore the changing management styles and everything else that kind of goes with kind of managing a different kind of workforce. It also provided us with a clear strategic plan, or at least something to work towards in terms of recruitment and training. And the process of building the model and refining the assumptions kind of greatly improved our understanding of the business, the interrelations between the different departments, and obviously has massively assisted us in populating the force management statement. And finally, we did get the process externally audited, and that achieved a substantial assurance rating, which was fantastic. So the overall assessment was that a sound system of governance, risk management and control existed, with internal controls operating effectively and being consistently applied to support the achievement of our objectives. And the only kind of area for improvement that was identified was around applying some sensitivity analysis within the process. So how changes to some of the assumptions that we had around some of our scenarios would how that kind of impacted our long-term requirements. So yeah, overall it's been a really great process to be a part of, and relatively successful. Does anyone have any questions?
I thought that looked very good. Thank you.
Any questions? Harriet, what would you say was the biggest challenge? So you talked about organisational buy-in, you talked about data, the forecasting. Which one would you suggest was the biggest stumbling block for you in that project?
I think it was probably identifying the data inputs and reliable data inputs into the model. I know that's been something that's been mentioned before, sort of in the last presentation, but yeah, particularly around that skills data set. But it's given us a real indication of, you know, where we need to focus our attention as a force in terms of gaining those reliable data sets. And I think as well, it's kind of our ramp modelling sits within our intelligence tasking directorate. So the demand analysts that look at the more short-term tactical demand modelling kind of utilise ramp. Us looking at that more strategic long-term picture, we're using the workforce planner, so it's just getting that you know, engagement and making sure our scenarios link together, the tactical with the strategic. So there's tactical decisions being made around the movement of resources kind of day to day, like do we move some of our investigative workload into local policing? But then, you know, when you kind of look at the kind of strategic PCC priorities, that they want more visibility, you've got that you know, you've got that kind of conflict, I guess, in terms of making some of those shorter term decisions.
Brilliant. Certainly that shock of having lots of PIP2 investigators, none of which look to be trained, it must have been a bit of a shock. I see that Peter's got his hand up, so should we throw over to him for his question?
Thanks, Ali. Hi, Harriet.
Hello.
Well, thank you for that presentation. From my point of view, having obviously been involved from the start in supporting you, and it being a new area of business for all of us, and I think for policing as well, I've not come across any forces who are that far advanced in looking at the strategic planning, sort of 5 years and more ahead. Well done. It's really pleasing. It's gone well. Just a question. You talked about understanding your COVID suppression more, and I was just interested to know what your conclusions were in terms of, I think it's probably fair to say most of the data sets we've seen is demand, certainly in particular types of incident and crime, came down quite a bit during the COVID period and has now started to show a recovery. I just wondered what you thought the long-term picture was going to be, and do you see demand returning to pre-COVID levels? Is it already there? Are you expecting a continuation of previous trends, or do you think there's some residual effect of COVID such that some demand will be gone forever?
Yeah, I do believe that. I might need to bring in Sophia, who I know is on the call, who did all that that kind of demand forecasting, refreshed it more recently. But yeah, no, definitely, depending on the crime type, you know, particularly when you look at things like the nighttime economy, you know, that was severely impacted by by COVID and that returning back to normal, you know, is slow. I think when we've looked at the when we forecasted forward, even factoring we kind of took a few approaches in that we forecasted data from pre-COVID. Then we forecasted with the COVID demand volumes in, and then we also forecasted with kind of a suppression sort of recovery element to the forecasts, and the seasonality kind of remains the same across kind of our demand and incident forecasting. But yeah, the kind of some things are set to recover, and I think, you know, we've always got to kind of consider that proactive crime versus reactive crime, because you know, that has an impact as well. So some crime types you can forecast quite well, and others are far more difficult because it depends on your proactive capacity. But Sophia, I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there anything additional you'd like to add to that?
No, just that I guess we're still in that period of unknown. I guess we don't really know what's going to happen. We're not at the stage yet where things have returned to normality. When that will happen, I guess, is we're going to have to keep tracking the demand and seeing where that leads. So we did exactly as Harriet said. We looked at different forecasts, including different data. We kind of debated, do we exclude COVID completely? Do we include it? And, you know, and that had massive impacts on the forecasting. So it was just a matter of how much do we incorporate COVID? How much is it still impacting us now? And for how much longer will it impact us for? So it's just kind of, we've been trying to we haven't excluded COVID, but it's like taking it into account. And how is that going to impact demand going forward until we hit that? Well, I think we're thinking that it will hit a pre-COVID normality, but also, as you said, Peter, some crimes may never go back. We may have a change in society, and I think for us it's just keeping an eye out and tracking that.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so thank you very much to Harriet and the team for that, because I think it's been very useful to hear all about the use of that tool there.